Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to come from the 115th Psalm. And the title of this discourse is An Intellectual Indictment of Idolatry. Now, an indictment of idolatry is nothing new or unusual in the Old Testament. As I've explained in other discourses, it's the most frequent injunctions against sin is idolatry, largely because, once we detach ourselves from our infallible moral compass, every bet is off in every aspect of our life. So the idolatry is very much the sin which leads into every other sin. And this was a constant temptation and a frequent failure of the nation of Israel. Now, the psalm is, the authorship is anonymous, but most scholars believe that it was written either during the exile or immediately after the exile, when Israel was punished by idolaters for succumbing to idolatry throughout their 490-year period from Joshua to Jeremiah. But the emphasis of this psalm, which is also replicated, the meat or the part that exposes the folly or fallacy of idolatry, is replicated in Psalm 135. But it's unique or unusual, at the very least, in that it exposes the innate stupidity of idolatry. So idolaters are not only morally inferior human beings, but also intellectually so. So that's why I titled it the way I did. So without further ado, we're going to get into the text itself. Not to us, O Yahweh, not to us, but to your name give esteem, for your kindness, for your truth. So the psalmist really has his priorities in order. Everything that we do in the name of Yahweh is not about us. It's always 100% of the time about him. And the name was the third commandment in the Decalogue, immediately after the injunction against idolatry. The first four sacred commandments of the Decalogue are all interconnected. The first one is against polytheism. We're to have one God only who's to be the object of our reverence and worship. And he was not to be worshipped, and since he's a purely spiritual human being, he could not be represented or approached in physical terms. And idols were the functions through which the spiritually inferior civilizations worship their gods. And the name is just to give reverence and respect. Now, names were of merely symbolic significance in the Hebrew culture. Every prophet and exemplary leader in the Old Testament and in the New Testament, their Hebrew name very much carries symbolic significance. We ultimately don't have time to get into that. That's a separate discussion altogether. Why should the Gentiles say, "Where now is their Elohim?" But our Elohim is in the heavens. Whatever pleases him, he has done. So this gives an explanation. As I said, this was written either during, according to scholarly consensus, either during or after the exile. So their punishment was with a purpose. They had a covenant, which was a two-way street, which promised blessings and prosperity for obedience and warnings of consequences for disobedience. So because they frequently succumbed to idolaters, they were captured and held captive by idolaters. And so everything in history moves according to its inexorable march by the providential overseer and controller of history, who is Elohim, who knows the beginning from the end. Now, he granted us with moral agency, and even though through revelation he gives us the beginning from the end, we know how the end times are going to unfold. The majority of our lives are to be lived without the benefit of foresight. So it's up to us to figure out and to make the correct decisions. But he didn't dishonor his pledge of the covenant, and Deuteronomy 28 is an excellent study for the blessings and curses thereof. Their idols are silver and gold, the work of men's hands. So the difference between Yahweh or Elohim and idols is that Yahweh made us in his image, Genesis 1:26 through 28 and 5:1, whereas the idols are made in man's image. These are very much not where Yahweh was the embodiment of conceivable moral perfection. The idols were very much human, all too human, to appropriate a quotation from Friedrich Nietzsche, who incidentally was a militant anti-theist. But they were a reflection of the black perverted hearts of their creator. They were essentially teenagers throwing hissy fits. Their moral outrages, or they're really immoral outrages. They were subject to whim. There was something completely arbitrary about, and they were worshipped to appease them, not because of any moral consequence. And this actually focuses more on the physical nature of idols, as we're going to read. They have mouths, but they do not speak. They have eyes, but they do not see. Now, Yahweh, as we already mentioned, is a completely spiritual being. He cannot be depicted in physical likeness on account of that. To do so is to misrepresent him. Yet he's knowable or observable on the sensory level. We hear that he speaks to prophets, and through them he speaks to us. Now, the voice of the Almighty, there's a misnomer amongst moderns that it's an obsolete practice. He no longer speaks to his men. The practice died out with the essential writing of the New Testament, but plenty of saints throughout the generations have been moved and prompted by a physical voice of the Almighty. And I've read a few books on it. I could even recommend, the titles don't immediately come to mind, but they essentially say, if you want God to speak to you, pray for it continually. Now, I'm not entirely sure that I've been called to hear the voice of the Almighty, but I am entirely 100% certain that he speaks to me through the voice of his prophets in this word, and he's speaking to you right now through me. In eyes, but they do not see. Now, Yahweh's clearly able to see his creation, yet he doesn't have physical eyes. Now, he's depicted in what is known as anthropomorphisms, which is a Greek term meaning human likenesses, because he's essentially otherwise unknowable. He works from the foundation of what is known to explain the unknown. So we read that the hand of the Almighty, it's not a literal hand, but it's a relatable analogy for explaining what is otherwise incomprehensible. They have ears but do not hear. They have noses but do not smell. They have hands but they do not handle. They have feet but they do not walk. They make no sound through their throat. The ones who make them shall become like them, all who trust in them. So because we worship the conceivable perfection, embodiment of conceivable perfection, we acquire his attributes in our finite forms, and we reflect these attributes that he radiates, and ultimately we fall short. But spiritually, because these idols are completely without substance, their image or representation is more metaphysically real than what they're supposed to represent. So our spiritual life only has as much substance as the object we worship. And Yahweh is of infinite substance, unlike the idols, who are completely imaginary and useless and immovable. They only exist in idol form. So you're praying to a non-existent being when you pray to them, and you're reflecting the attributes of someone whose attributes exist in your own flawed imagination. So there's really no moral compass or intellectual compass to them. O Israel, trust in Yahweh, he is their help and their shield. O house of Aaron, trust in Yahweh, he is their help and their shield. You who revere Yahweh, trust in Yahweh, he is their help and their shield. So this is a three-time reiteration. Now, Israel was the nation to whom were chosen. They were specially selected to represent Yahweh to a lost and fallen world who had become estranged to him by the time that he called out Abraham and made himself known to humanity once more. And they were to reflect, their reflection was to be a witness in the way that they lived in the nation of Israel, and ultimately they fell short. But the house of Aaron were the house of high priest, the brother of Moses. Throughout the greater duration of the monarchical or even national period of Israel, the office of high priest was vested in a descendant of Abraham, Aaron. And by the new covenant, invitation to know and to proclaim Yahweh is pan-national. The new covenant is not restricted or limited to the nation of Israel. The invitation is open to all. So it is perhaps with prophetic premonition not entirely known to the psalmist that he includes the line that you who revere Yahweh, you is an implicitly universal invitation. Yahweh has remembered us. He has blessed us. He blessed the house of Israel. He blessed the house of Aaron. He blessed those who fear Yahweh, the small and the great. Now, there is small and great is entirely irrelevant to Yahweh. He exalts the humble and humbles the exalted. So it's almost advantageous for us to approach him from a state of nothingness and humility. And he blessed us. Now, this is an odd thing to say during or after, maybe less odd after the exile, because he returned them to their temple and their land and their promised land, and they had more reason to feel like the chosen people. Yet he blessed them in cursing them because he honored his end of the covenant. And ultimately, it was the period of the exile which irrevocably purged the idolatrous inclinations of Israel. By the New Testament times, the Jews throughout the Bible were never prone to moderation. They had fluctuated to the opposite extreme, the legalism. So they were obsessively mechanical, and they had laws this big, just adding to the laws of Moses, which were neither authorized nor inspired. But ultimately, he did bless the nation of Israel, who, on more occasions than not, and in most cases, there were certainly exemplary examples from them. But the Bible also records the warts and all. In this, they were unique amongst historical recordings of the ancient world, because the field of study of history as an objective pursuit was almost entirely unknown. The annals recorded by rival civilizations would invariably depict their kings and their civilization in positive lights. And we don't have time to get into this, but a lot of secular liberal theologians disclaim the Exodus account because the Egyptians made no such recording of it, but it wouldn't be in their interest to do so, to lose an entire enslaved people and have their gods, all 10 of them, through the 10 plagues, rebuked and dismantled. Yahweh give you increase more and more, you and your children. You are blessed by Yahweh, who made the heavens and the earth. So this is the ultimate distinction between Yahweh and the idols. The idols are the works of man's hand, whereas Yahweh made Elohim, more broadly, made everything in existence. The heavens are the heavens of Yahweh, but he has given the earth to the children of men. So this takes us to the first 2 chapters in Genesis. In Genesis 1, we read that he created the heavens and the earth. And by the end of the first chapter of Genesis, we read that he delegated the task of stewardship to humanity through Adam, and through him to us. So we are charged as regents in how we manage the world in which we are the dominant species of, and how we marshal the resources that he abundantly supplies to us. We're all going to have to answer to that eventually. And on the whole, we've done not a noteworthy job, in all honesty, but we are all judged individually, and we do live in a lost and fallen world, which in some sense we do inherit from Adam, yet we cannot excuse our own sin just because we're born with an invariably sinful nature. The dead do not praise Yah, nor any going down to silence. Now, the dead, he means eternally so. So even when we are dead, the saints are resurrected. So death is a beginning of a new life, whereas those who have the opposite outlook and are met with the opposite outcome, eternal death, separation from the Father in heaven. But we bless Yah now and forever. Hallelujah. Now, on retrospective examination, it's easy for us to sneer at the Israelites for having the blessing of revelation and repeatedly rejecting that revelation and falling into idolatry when they had the superior revelation of the Almighty heaven, maker of heaven and earth. Yet there is a misnomer amongst us moderns that the practice of idolatry is antiquated and obsolete. Now, the practice of worshiping and bowing down to statues may no longer be prominent, but the adversary has adjusted his because essentially it's the adversary who's worshipped through idolatry. He's adjusted the ancient practice to fit modern times. We may not bow or worship to statues made of earthly items, but the worship of material substance, be it wealth, power, prestige, celebrity, is clearly endemic in our culture. Now, these things have been with humanity since the beginning of time, but they have acquired a new prominence in the modern world. So it's really incumbent upon us to take heart and to learn from the negative examples without ridiculing or dismissing them, and maybe see ourselves in Israel. And that's an ultimately exalted standard to abide by. And that concludes today's message. Thank you so much. Tune in next time. Bye-bye.